So hello everyone. I'm a little nervous and a little excited to be here with you all. So my name is Chona. I'm a teacher, I'm a scientist, and I'm also a science communicator and content creator for YouTube. And just like most of everyone here, I'm trying to cope with our strange new world, and I'm wondering what will be happening in the future. But also, as an advocate and a believer of education and science communication, one of the things I worry about is how we will proceed with education, considering how the COVID-19 pandemic and its viral vector has been evolving, which I think one of our participants was asking about in the chat earlier. So I show here the Kubler-Ross grief cycle, and it more or less represents the feelings that we have whenever we encounter something sad or bad in our lives. And a lot of us probably have our emotional and mental response following the same cycle since our lifestyles have changed these past couple of years. So some of us may be undergoing depression, some of us might be angry, some of us might still be avoiding this new reality. But as teachers and students, especially on this journey of evolving education, we have to accept the new conditions that we have. Anger, frustration, and general disbelief of the potential effectiveness of online learning will just be hindrances to our teaching and our learning. Now, even in a perfect world where everybody has high-speed internet and we have all the high-tech gadgets to facilitate online learning and online teaching are not for everyone. Based on my experience as both an online learner and an online teacher, online learning works best for students who can work independently and understand that while there is flexibility in when to work each day, there needs to be a time set aside to work on and actively participate in each of the subjects that they're taking up. So what we're seeing right now is that our students and even some of our teachers will naturally filter into those who really want to learn or really want to teach and have the discipline and imagination to learn a little bit more independently. Now, this does not mean that we leave the rest of our students behind or the rest of our teachers behind. But I guess a lot of us must also accept that some of us might have to wait for a better time before we continue our education. Now, the disturbance that we're all experiencing now is not completely unique. Armed conflicts, forced displacement, climate change-induced disasters, and protracted crises have disrupted the education of close to 75 million children and youth globally throughout the past decade alone, and much more before that, especially if we consider World War I, World War II, and the other pandemics that the world has encountered. But let us speak of the now, because only in our awareness of our situation can we move forward. Education has been hit particularly hard by the COVID-19 pandemic, with 1.53 billion learners out of school and 184 countrywide school closures, which has impacted 87.6% of the world's total enrolled learners. Dropout rates across the globes are likely to rise as a result of this massive disruption to education access. And while other critical needs, such as health, water, and sanitation are being responded to, educational needs cannot be forgotten, and these have an equally detrimental impact if we left it unaddressed. What I'm worried about, for example, is the so-called pile-on effect of the coronavirus, which is the fact that during the global COVID-19 pandemic that we're experiencing now, interruptions to education can actually have long-term implications, especially for the most vulnerable. There is a real risk of regression for students whose basic foundational learning in reading, math, and languages were not strong enough to begin with, and millions of children who have already been deprived of their right to education, particularly girls, are being more exposed to health and well-being risks that are both psychosocial and physical during COVID-19. Without access to education, as we experience traumatic shocks, including loss of life, health impacts, and loss of livelihoods, students are actually more vulnerable and unprotected. And as household finances are being strained and the needs of the house continue to increase, out-of-school children are more likely to be exposed to risks like family violence, child labor, forced marriage, trafficking, and exploitation, including by responders. And the thing is, I really believe that for the most vulnerable of students, education is life-saving. Not only does it provide safety and protection, importantly, it also instills hope for a brighter future. So continuing education through alternative learning pathways as soon as possible must also be a top priority right now to ensure the interruption to education is as limited as possible. We urgently need to support teachers, parents, caregivers, innovators, communication experts, and all those who are positioned to provide education, whether through radio programs, homeschooling, online learning, and other innovative approaches. But we must also remind our educators, our students, well, in fact, everyone, that the lessons we might learn through online learning would not necessarily be the same, but not necessarily less than those we used to learn face-to-face. Now, in the short term, this means we must maintain access to learning and ensure our students retain knowledge and skills. In the medium term, this means catching up and transitioning students who have fallen behind or had a break in their education to rejoin their level of schooling and competencies. And in the long term, this means there is a need for education systems to evolve and to set up contingency capacities to mitigate and manage risks in the future. Because sadly, this is probably not the last pandemic that we will encounter. So how do we create national or even global infrastructures to make sure that the last, the least, and the lost are not left behind in this strange but brave new world? And as scientists, what innovations do we need for those studying STEM? Specializing in STEM fields often require extensive exposure in the lab or in the field in order to be familiar with the different techniques needed to study cells, the environment, and the forces of nature. Doing it at home or virtually will not compensate for the highly sensitive processes and skills needed to work in a laboratory. And as the Philippines and the rest of the world seeks to meet its research goals and expand the population of scientists in the country and the world, how focused are our resources in ensuring our STEM students will finish and succeed? What is it like, really, to study during a pandemic? And how must we evolve to create the next generation of professionals in the world? And how does this play in ensuring gender equality in STEM, given that even before the pandemic, there were less women in STEM already, and studies are now still showing that girls are still made more vulnerable with the pandemic? And also, given the uniqueness of this forum, how do our students think we should adjust our education to fit their needs? Now, as probably the oldest person in this discussion, I wish I can leave you all with the answers. But just like our students, us teachers are confused, as scared, and as challenged by this pandemic. And I hope that we all can find kindness and creativity as we innovate and evolve. Participating in this forum is part of my innovation, which includes the creation of the She Ensha channel on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram, where I hope to share the beauty of science to a wider audience. But before I end this short talk, let me just go back to my question. How should education adapt to the pandemic? So thank you very much for this opportunity, and I'm looking forward to your answers and also to your questions. Thank you.
Hello. Yes. Hello, Miss Chona. So I think education can adapt to the pandemic through the utilization of better technologies and maybe through partnerships with the government and industry. So my question for you is, so a lot of future engineers and future scientists are currently studying in the online setup. So as a person who's studying engineering online, I know that laboratory is very different. And I feel like I am not sufficiently prepared for the real world situations. So would this mean that once we graduate, let's say once we graduate from college, would this mean that the engineers and the scientists who studied online would need extra training before they're able to work?
Thank you for that question, Gio. That's actually something that we're still brainstorming about because even work setups in the future is expected to change. A lot of our engineers right now are also working from home. But at the end of it, there are still laboratory experiments and fieldwork that need to be done face to face. So I believe that if we are to catch up with the things that we're missing out on with the pandemic, our work environments or perhaps our universities can share the burden of catching up our students when it comes to these very stringent and high-end laboratory and field procedures. However, if I'm going to be completely honest with you as a professional, a lot of the lab activities I learned as a college student were no longer useful when I started working as a scientist, mostly because the technology has upgraded quite quickly. And so a lot of the techniques I've used in the lab recently are things I learned as an employee. So that's actually not a strange thing or a new thing. But I think one thing that a lot of our teachers and students must figure out how to do now is how do we create an environment where we are all adaptable, where we don't get overwhelmed by new things, where we're not threatened by the idea of creating something new or learning something new, so that we can all fall on our feet running once things become a little bit safer for us to come out and do physical work again. So I hope my answer helps, Gio.
Yes, thank you so much.
Hi, Doc Chana. Um, how should education adapt to the pandemic? Actually, this is a very hard question. Um, in my part as an educator as well, I am now teaching in university. I'm also having a hard time to teach, and it's my first time also to teach online, and it is very different in teaching online face to face. Um, we all know that we have different techniques or strategies on how to teach everything. But now, since I'm teaching science subjects, major subjects as well, in the laboratory, if the techniques or the experiments should fit to the skills that is needed in the field, for example, in biology, you have to know how to do pipetting. But for example, in work, you have to do it as well. Um, we should I guess we should work hand in hand together with other people, creating innovative learning experiences where a teacher and a student um, should learn from one another. It is not all about the it's not all about the learnings that we'll get from now. It's all about the knowledge. Is all about the experiences that we will share in the near future. Like what you've mentioned earlier, that this will not be the last pandemic we're going to face. And I think, borrowing the words of other presenters earlier, um, we should adopt or we should know or learn on if, for example, there are other pandemic that will exist in the near future, we should learn on how to adapt to it. Um, Still, education is still part of our lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Kenneth. By the way, Kenneth is one of my graduate students at the La Salle University, and I cannot be more proud of how he was able to articulate his experience as an educator himself. But apart from what Kenneth has already mentioned, we can also consider innovations that democratize our technologies. One of the reasons why it's so hard to teach laboratories at home is because of how expensive a lot of our laboratory equipments are. But compared to, let's say, 10 years ago, you can now purchase a microscope, a functional microscope at home at a fraction of the cost of what it was. So I dream of a future where we have democratized science to a point where an interested primary school student, an elementary school student, or high school student can buy a pipetter in the mall, or a microscope or a scientific equipment that's safe to use at home, of course. As much as we're all buying our PlayStations and our cell phones, because I think at the end of the day, as I think a lot of parents would agree, investing in these equipment would be a much better investment than a lot of the gadgets that become phased out in a year or so. But yeah, that's a dream that I hope can come true faster because of the needs of this pandemic. Thank you.
Hello, good evening, Doc Chona. So I just wanted to ask, well, firstly, thank you for the very wonderful presentation. It was really inspiring, and it really, I'm sure that a lot of people here are impacted by your presentation. And so with that, I'd just like to ask, especially since you were tackling about education in the post-pandemic, I mean, in the pandemic, um, there's a not really a research, but it is known that the longer, for example, the quarantine measures, or the longer that children specifically, aren't in classrooms, the more that these children are discouraged to go to school, or that the more that the dropout rates on school is rising. So I just wanted to ask, how can we encourage these children to, still continue studying despite what like what you said, it might happen again, or something might happen again that might discourage students. So how can we encourage them, and also what is your opinion about that? That's all. Thank you.
Thank you for that very challenging question, Akiko. And it's so nice to hear your voice again after a very long time. Um, that's actually a very hard question because it goes at the heart of why students want to learn and why students don't want to go to school. Because learning and going to school are two completely different things. I think a lot of the billionaires in the 21st century have shown us that education, formal education, is not necessarily a requirement to success. But the thing is, a huge part of the world is still fascinated with the potential of formal education. And I am included in that. It's just that we also have to come to accept the fact that it might not be for everyone. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Being someone who's not a degree holder but is successful and is contributing well in the world, I think that person is successful in his, her, or their own right. But for those who actually want to get that formal education, well, for students, you have to have that internal motivation. How much do I want this? What am I willing to do to get this degree? What do I want to learn from it? And if we remind ourselves that every day, no matter how tough it gets, I think we can still find the energy and the drive to get up, get in front of that screen, and study. But there also needs to be a change among us teachers. I feel so sad and worried that a lot of our teachers are the ones responsible for our students losing love for science and studying. And it's because a lot of us have always believed that studying is just about memorizing, memorizing, memorizing. it's just about getting high scores in exams. When studying is about cultivating wonder, it's about cultivating curiosity. It's about asking our students to be fascinated with the same things we are fascinated in. And there are some limitations because we are supposed to give you exams every once in a while, which is never fun. But that's why I also challenged myself to create a YouTube channel. How can I make the science that I love so much be more interesting to a wider audience? And I found that it has changed my attitude and how I teach my subjects in a significant way, because it got me asking myself, what do I want my students to be after they take my class? Do I just want them to have memorized an entire book? Or do I want them to become responsible students who believe in the power of science, but are also responsible enough to know its limitations? So I think a lot of our teachers should be asked to reconsider these things so that we can create improvements in our education system.
I just want to add to what Doc Chona mentioned earlier about self-motivation. Actually, she's correct about it. Um, Internal motivation is very important to one student in order for her or him to succeed or go to school. It's all about the willingness to learn the subject matter. It's all about the love of the subject matter. It Education and to students is a two-way relationship process where a teacher should teach his or her students on how to love the subject matter. We do not spoon feed the student like this is what you need to learn, this is what you need to do. It's all about teaching the students on how to love, on what to love, or what's the beauty of the subject itself. And the student, if the student is not willing to learn, it is very hard for you to accept the knowledge that what your teacher gives you. Um, the challenge of a teacher is to create an atmosphere or environment that makes your student in love with your subject. We should not create an ambience where a student makes you demotivated or scared of you because you're always angry, you always give quizzes, or you always give activities. Give them time, give them a little happiness, or enjoy the subject itself. Thank you.